Chapter 1. Introduction. Myth and Reality of the Assassins. Hardly any secret society of the Middle Ages has fired the imagination of the people as much as the assassins. Their name became synonymous with silent murder, with fanatical fighters in the shadows who used daggers and cunning to eliminate kings, generals, and religious leaders. Even contemporaries spoke with fear and admiration of these men, who were supposedly ready to sacrifice their lives without hesitation, often on behalf of a mysterious master who sent them from an impregnable fortress in the mountains. The term assassin itself is part of this myth. Many chroniclers of the Middle Ages derived it from the Arabic word hashashian, which means hashish eater. They claimed that the attackers had put themselves in a state of intoxication with drugs before they went to their deaths. Later, this story was spread by Marco Polo, who reported that Hasan-i Sabbah, the legendary founder of the movement, led his followers into magnificent gardens with beguiling virgins to make them believe in paradise. After that, they blindly obeyed his command, convinced that their sacrifice would take them directly to heaven. Whether these stories are true is still disputed today. They probably arose from the mixture of fear, ignorance, and fascination felt by the opponents of the assassins. In truth, the Nizarites, as they called themselves, were not misguided fanatics, but a religious political movement within Shia Islam. They had a clear goal: to build their own community that could exist independently of the Sunni rulers of the Middle East. Their methods differed from the armies of their enemies. Instead of fighting in open battles, they relied on targeted assassinations against powerful personalities, a procedure that gave them enormous effect. Where other armies had to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers, a few men who were willing to risk their lives to hit a symbol were enough for them. The fear they spread was their strongest weapon. But the history of the assassins is not only the story of daggers and assassinations. It is also the story of faith and identity, of persecution and resistance, of a community that wanted to survive in the midst of powerful empires. The assassins were both bitter opponents of the Sunni caliphs and occasional allies of the Crusaders. They lived in castles high in the mountains of Persia and Syria, where they developed their own culture, administration, and way of life. For more than 2 centuries, they were a feared power factor in the Middle East. Only the Mongols and Mamluks brought about their end, destroyed their fortresses, and erased many of their traces. But even then, their legacy survived, in the legends of their enemies, in the writings of travelers, and in the fascination that continues to this day. Today, we know that the assassins were not mysterious shadow beings, but part of the Shiite Ismailis that exist to this day, in a peaceful, modern form under the leadership of the Aga Khan. But the myth that surrounds them remains stronger than any historical clarification. Thus, at the beginning of our journey, the assassins stand as an enigma, between truth and legend, between religion and politics, between terror and idealism. To understand them, we need to look not only at the daggers and assassinations, but also at the world in which they lived, a world of religious wars, intrigues, and power struggles in which the assassins forged their own path.
Chapter 2. The Origins, Islam and the Shiite and Sunni Divide. To understand the assassins, you have to go far back, to the beginnings of Islam. Because their movement was not suddenly there, it arose from the tensions and conflicts that have shaped the Islamic world since the death of the Prophet Muhammad. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, he left no clear regulation as to who should take over the leadership of the young Muslim community. Many of his companions saw the caliph as a political and religious successor, but the question of who was allowed to hold this office divided the faithful. Some accepted the election of the first caliphs Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. They later became the Sunnis. Another part, however, insisted that only a direct relative of the Prophet was entitled to the leadership. For them, Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, was the rightful successor. This group became the nucleus of the Shiites. The dispute led to fighting, intrigue, and bloody battles. Ali eventually became caliph himself, but was murdered in Kufa in 661. His followers considered him a martyr, while power finally passed into the hands of the Sunni Umayyad dynasty. But the Shiites did not give up their claim. For them, succession was a divine destiny.
Only the descendants of Ali, the so-called imams, could legally lead the community. This marked the beginning of a development that still characterizes the Islamic world today, the division between Sunni and Shiites. While the Sunnis saw the caliph as a secular ruler, the Shiites revered their imams as spiritual leaders with almost sacred status. Again and again, there were uprisings and movements that defended this claim. One of these movements was the Ismailis, which emerged in the 8th century. They invoked Ismail, a son of the 6th Shiite imam, and developed their own doctrine. For them, the imam was not only a religious leader, but a bearer of hidden knowledge, a mediator between God and man. Their interpretation of Islam was strongly influenced by mysticism and secret society structures, characteristics that were later to have a decisive influence on the assassins. The Ismailis even founded their own empire, the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa and Egypt, which existed from 909 to 1171. From there, they spread their teachings and represented a serious competitor to the Sunni Abbasids in Baghdad. But within the Ismailis themselves, divisions eventually emerged. When it came to the succession of an imam, two groups were formed, the Nizarites and the Mustalites. The Nizarites, who invoked the Imam Nizar, were later to form the community of assassins. Its center became Persia, and its most famous leader was Hasan-i Sabbah, the founder of Alamut. This shows that the history of the assassins does not begin with daggers and assassinations, but with a theological dispute over succession and legitimacy. Their movement was part of a much larger conflict that had shaken the Islamic world for centuries. In this field of tension between religion and politics, between faith and power, the community was formed that was soon to spread terror and fascination throughout the Middle East. Chapter 3. The Ismailis, a religious movement emerges. The Ismailis are among the most fascinating currents within Shiite Islam. They were the spiritual forerunners of the later assassins, and without their ideas, structures, and longing for hidden knowledge, the Nizarites would not have existed in their special form. The Ismailis emerged in the 8th century from an internal split among the Shiites. The focus was on the question of the succession of the 6th Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq. Some of his followers recognized his son, Ismail, as his rightful successor, even though Ismail died during his father's lifetime. For this group, however, it was clear the succession had to be continued by Ismail or his line. Thus, the Ismailis formed as an independent movement. What made the Ismailis special was their idea of the Imam. For them, he was not only a political or religious leader, but a bearer of divine light, a mediator of hidden truths. They developed a strongly esoteric theology. Behind the external religious precepts, Zahir, was an inner, deeper meaning, batin, that only the Imam and his closest followers knew. In this way, they differed greatly from the Sunnis, who tended to insist on the literal meaning of the Quran. This emphasis on secret knowledge made the Ismailis attractive to many, but also suspicious. In a world in which the caliph in Baghdad claimed to be the supreme ruler of all Muslims, the Ismailis seemed like an underground movement. Their missionaries, Dai, traveled from city to city, often in secret, to gain followers. They built a network that spanned the entire Middle East, North Africa, and even India. The greatest success of the Ismailis was the establishment of the Fatimid Caliphate in 909. This dynasty, which claimed to be descended from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, established a powerful empire in North Africa. Later, the Fatimids moved their capital to Cairo, where they created a brilliant culture that promoted science, architecture, and trade. Among them, the famous Al-Azhar University was founded, which still exists today. But the unity of the Ismailis did not last forever. When it came to the succession of a Fatimid caliph, the movement split again. Two groups were formed, the Mustalites, who followed the Imam al-Mustali, and the Nizarites, who swore allegiance to Nizar, another pretender to the throne. For the Nizarites, Nizar was the rightful Imam, and although he was defeated and killed, they believed his lineage still had a claim to leadership. This division was decisive. While the Mustalites remained in Egypt and continued their community there, the Nizarites sought new centers, especially in the Persian region. And it was here that a man soon appeared on the scene who would lead their movement in a completely new direction,
Hasan-i Sabbah, the founder of the legendary assassins' fortress of Alamut. The Ismailis had thus laid the foundations: an esoteric theology, a network of missionaries, a strong loyalty to the Imam. From this foundation, the assassins grew, not as an isolated sect, but as a radical evolution of an already powerful movement.
Chapter 4. Hasan-i Sabbah, the founder of the assassins. Every movement needs a charismatic figure to turn its ideas into action. To the assassins, this was Hasan-i Sabbah, a man who, with iron conviction and unwavering discipline, formed a community that spread fear and respect for centuries. His name is still inextricably linked with the legend of the assassins. Hasan was born around 1050 in the Persian city of Qom, at a time when Persia was ruled by the Sunni Seljuks. From an early age, he showed a sharp mind and a passion for knowledge. He received a thorough education in theology, philosophy, and the natural sciences. At a young age, he joined the Ismailis, a decision that would determine his life. At that time, the Ismailis were an oppressed minority in the Seljuk Empire. Their teachings were considered dangerous, their missionaries seditious. Hasan, however, was convinced of the message. Only the line of the Nizarite imams was legitimate, and it was the duty of the faithful to stand up for their cause. He devoted himself to this mission with fanatical zeal. His rise began when he took a leading role in the Ismaili mission itself. He traveled through Persia, gaining followers and looking for a place where he could establish an impregnable base. He finally found this place in the mountains of the Alborz Mountains, the fortress of Alamut. Alamut was originally a small castle, perched high on a rock, difficult to access and easy to defend. Hasan managed to take over the castle in 1090, not by open battle, but by cunning. He sent missionaries to the area, won over the local population, and eventually took over the fortress without much bloodshed. This created the heart of what would later become the assassin state. From Alamut, Hasan began to build his system. He organized the community in a strictly hierarchical way, with the imam at the top, even if he remained hidden, and himself as his representative. He placed the greatest value on discipline, obedience, and faith. His followers, the so-called Fedayin, were trained to be fanatical fighters, ready to carry out any order, even if it cost their lives. Hasan himself lived an ascetic and strict life. He forbade luxury, adhered to strict religious rules, and demanded the same from his followers. Legend has it that he even had 2 of his own sons executed, one for drunkenness, the other for murder, to show that no one was above the law. But Hasan was not only a religious leader, but also a master of strategy. He knew that his small community was militarily no match for the all-powerful Seljuks and Crusaders. Instead, he relied on a new form of warfare: targeted assassinations. Instead of providing armies, he sent individual Fedayin to eliminate powerful enemies with daggers. These acts spread fear and respect far beyond the borders. Hasan-i Sabbah died in Alamut in 1124, after more than 3 decades at the head of his community. During this time, he had created an empire based on loyalty, faith, and discipline, and which, despite its small size, was capable of terrifying emperors, caliphs, and crusaders. His legacy was the idea that power does not lie in armies and riches alone, but in conviction, organization, and the willingness to sacrifice one's life for a cause. Hasan-i Sabbah began the legend of the assassins, a legend that would continue long after his death. Chapter 5. Alamut, the impregnable fortress. In the heart of the Alborz Mountains, north of Qazvin in present-day Iran, rises a rugged rock. On this rock stood a castle whose name made history: Alamut, the eagle's nest. It became the symbol of the assassins, their headquarters, their spiritual and strategic center. Without Alamut, the movement would never have become what it meant in the world of the Middle Ages. Hasan-i Sabbah had taken the fortress into his hands in 1090. According to tradition, he did not succeed through war, but through patience and clever infiltration. He won over the local population to the teachings of the Ismailis and eventually installed his followers in the castle until he had taken complete control.
He thus had a place that was made for the purposes of the new community, difficult to reach, easy to defend, and surrounded by loyal followers. Alamut was much more than just a military fortress. Hassan made it the spiritual center of his movement. A system of administration, training, and religious teaching arose here. The library of Alamut is said to have been famous. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of manuscripts were collected here, not only religious texts, but also works of philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The assassins saw themselves not only as fighters, but also as guardians of knowledge. Daily life in Alamut was strictly regulated. Hassan lived an ascetic life and demanded discipline, obedience, and simplicity from his followers. Alcohol and luxury were forbidden. Prayer and study were the focus. The fortress became a place where faith and strategy went hand in hand. Militarily, Alamut was almost impregnable. Its location high in the mountains made it difficult for large armies to access. Narrow paths led up, and the walls were built in such a way that attackers could be easily repulsed. In addition, over time, the assassins controlled a network of other castles that secured the area, small but efficient bases that together formed a defense system. From Alamut, Hassan steered his Fedayin. This is where they received their training, where the missions were planned. Many legends surround this place, from mysterious gardens to underground tunnels where the Fedayin were supposedly prepared for their missions. Marco Polo, who reported on the assassins centuries later, also linked Alamut to the story of the Garden of Paradise, in which Hassan stunned his fighters and put them into bliss in order to move them to fanatical obedience. Historically, this story is probably more myth than reality, but it shows how much Alamut fired the imagination. Alamut became not only a symbol of the power of the assassins, but also a thorn in the flesh of their enemies. The Seljuks repeatedly tried to take the fortress, but they failed due to the natural conditions and the determination of the defenders. For over a century, Alamut remained impregnable, until the Mongols finally arrived, sealing the end of the fortress with brute force and overwhelming superiority. But until then, Alamut was more than a castle. It was the heart of a state in miniature, a fortress of ideas, a place from which a small community influenced the course of history. The Eagle's Nest became the epitome of the assassins, their strength, their secrets, and their unwavering will to survive in a hostile world.
Chapter 6. The Training of the Fedayin: Discipline, Faith, and Secrets. The heart of the assassins' power was not only the fortress of Alamut, but above all their men, the Fedayin. They were the fighters, assassins, and loyal followers who were willing to sacrifice their lives on behalf of their masters. Their reputation was legendary, feared by kings, caliphs, and crusaders alike. But what made them so special? How did ordinary people become these unshakable tools of an idea? The training often began at a young age. Children from the communities loyal to the assassins were brought to Alamut. There they grew up in an environment that focused on discipline, faith, and loyalty. From the very beginning, they were taught that they were part of a chosen community that fought for the true teachings of Islam and stood against a world of enemies. The Fedayin first learned the basics of the faith. They studied the teachings of the Nizarites, practiced prayers and rituals, and internalized the duty of obedience to the imam and his representative, the old man of the mountain, as many contemporaries called Hasan-i Sabbah, and later his successors. This unwavering obedience was the foundation of their willingness to make any sacrifice. But religion alone did not make an assassin. The Fedayin were also trained physically and mentally. They trained in the use of the dagger, which was their most important weapon. They practiced camouflage, patience, and the art of mingling with people without arousing suspicion. They often had to live in enemy cities for months, gain trust in order to strike at the decisive moment. This did not require brute force, but self-control and strong nerves. An important part of the training was the inner attitude, the willingness to give up one's own life without hesitation. Many sources report that the Fedayin showed an extraordinary contempt for death. They threw themselves into the midst of enemies, committed assassinations in the hearts of opposing armies,
and often allowed themselves to be killed without attempting to escape. This readiness made them unpredictable and their opponents helpless. The question of why the Fedayin died so willingly has long occupied historians. Some legends claim that Hasan drugged them with hashish and led them to paradisical gardens to give them a taste of heaven. This story, written down by Marco Polo in the 13th century, was certainly exaggerated and served mainly to portray the assassins as fanatical, irrational fanatics. It is more likely that their motivation consisted of a mixture of faith, loyalty, and upbringing. The Fedayin were not willless puppets, but men who were convinced that they were dying for a higher cause. At a time when religion ruled all of life, the idea of martyrdom leading directly to paradise was more powerful than any threat. Hasan-i Sabbah knew how to use this faith and shape it with iron discipline. The result was a corps of assassins the likes of which the world had never seen before. They were few in number, but their deeds reverberated far and wide. A single Fedayi could spread more terror than 1,000 soldiers because no one knew where he would strike. Rulers slept in constant fear, generals wore chainmail even at festivals, and some refused to go out in public without bodyguards. The training of the Fedayin was thus not only military training, but psychological formation. Young men became fanatical fighters who completely subordinated their own person and their lives to one thing. This is what made the assassins so unique and so scary for their contemporaries.
Chapter 7: Strategy of Terror: Politics through Targeted Assassinations. The assassins were never a great power in the classical sense. They had no huge armies, no vast territories, no inexhaustible resources. But they possessed a weapon that could be more powerful than entire armies: targeted murder. Her strategy was unique in the Middle Ages, and she turned a small community into a factor that no one could ignore. Instead of fighting open battles, the assassins relied on terror through precision. They carefully chose their targets: influential princes, generals, governors, religious leaders. Their goal was never to kill indiscriminately, but to eliminate certain people whose deaths would have political consequences. Through this method, they were able to weaken rivals, intimidate enemies, and ensure their survival without ever having to raise a large army. The Fedayin almost always carried out their attacks in public. They were looking for the moment when their victim would be seen by many people, be it during a procession, praying in the mosque, or even in their own palace. Then they drew their dagger and rushed at the target. Often, they let themselves be killed immediately. Sometimes they fought to the last, but rarely did they try to escape. It was precisely this openness that made the act so frightening. Everyone knew that there was no security, not even in the heart of their own power. The wave of assassinations against the Seljuks, the powerful Sunni rulers of Persia, became famous. They were the greatest opponents of the assassins, and many of their dignitaries fell victim to the Fedayin's dagger. In 1092, for example, the Seljuk Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, one of the most capable statesmen of his time, was murdered. His death shook the entire empire and showed that the assassins were capable of hitting even the most powerful men. But the strategy of terror was not only directed against Muslims. The Crusaders in the Holy Land also experienced the blades of the assassins. Bishops, knights, and even kings were attacked. Some sources report that the famous King Conrad of Montferrat, who had been elected King of Jerusalem, was killed by assassins in 1192, an assassination attempt that had a decisive influence on the balance of power in the Crusader states. The assassins used their assassinations not only to directly eliminate enemies, but also for deterrence. The mere fear of them was often enough to make opponents submissive. Many rulers paid tributes or entered into alliances in order not to become a target themselves. Sometimes a dagger secretly placed in a general's tent was enough to send a clear message: "We can reach you at any time." This method was effective, but also dangerous. It made the assassins feared, but also hated. Many of their opponents saw them as assassins without honor, as enemies of all order.
But from the assassins' point of view, it was the only way to survive in a world of superiority. With just a few men, they were able to do what armies could not: keep the political situation moving. The strategy of terror was thus not blind killing, but a calculated instrument. It was terror with aim, propaganda by deed, politics with the dagger. No other order of the Middle Ages mastered this art as masterfully as the assassins, and that is why their name remains associated with fear and fascination to this day.
Chapter 8: Famous Assassinations, from Seljuks to the Crusaders. The history of the assassins is rich in assassinations that not only affected individual people, but also shook entire empires. Their daggers became political tools, their deeds messages that had an impact far beyond the immediate murder. Some of these attacks are still famous today, not only because of the victims, but because of the impact they had. The murder of Nizam al-Mulk, 1092. One of the earliest and most consequential assassination attempts was the murder of the Seljuk Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. This man was the Sultan's right-hand man, a clever statesman and bitter opponent of the Ismailis. For Hasan-i Sabbah and his followers, he was the embodiment of Sunni oppression. In 1092, during a trip by the Sultan, Nizam was stabbed to death by an assassin, supposedly disguised as a dervish. His death plunged the Seljuk Empire into crisis and proved that the assassins would not spare even the most powerful men. Attacks on Seljuk rulers. Other Seljuk princes also fell victim to the Fedayin. In the decades that followed, governors, military leaders, and judges were assassinated, often in the middle of the public. Particularly feared were the attacks in mosques during Friday prayers, a holy place that suddenly became a stage of blood and terror. Contacts and conflicts with the Crusaders. With the arrival of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, the assassins got new opponents, but also occasional allies. Their attitude towards the Crusader states was not uniform. Sometimes they fought Christian princes, sometimes they used alliances against common enemies. A famous victim was Conrad of Montferrat, who had been elected king of Jerusalem in 1192. Shortly after his election, he was attacked and mortally wounded by two assassins in the streets of Tyre. The exact background is still unclear today. Some suspect that the assassins were acting on behalf of Richard the Lionheart, or Saladin. Both had an interest in getting rid of Conrad. The only thing that is certain is that his death shook the fragile power structure of the Crusader states. Attack on Saladin. Even the legendary Muslim ruler Saladin, who later reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders, was targeted by the assassins. Twice in the 1170s, Fedayin tried to kill him, once even in his own tent camp. Both times, Saladin barely survived, but the attempts made it clear to him that the assassins were dangerous. It is said that he then formed a cautious alliance with them to prevent further attacks. Other attacks. Over the centuries, the murders piled up. Sunni judges in Baghdad, influential scholars, rival rulers in Syria and Persia. Some victims were political opponents, others religious enemies. The assassins always chose their targets wisely, not arbitrarily, but to achieve maximum effect. Effect and symbolism. What all these attacks had in common was their symbolic power. Everyone knew that if even a sultan, a king, or a general was not safe, then no one was safe. This ever-present fear was the real power of the assassins. Even if they carried out only a few attacks, it seemed as if they could strike any time and anywhere. This is how the Fedayin made history with the dagger. They left traces less through armies or empires than through targeted strikes that made kings, caliphs, and crusaders tremble, and which have remained in the collective memory to this day.
Chapter 9: The Crusaders and the Assassins, Enemies and Allies. When the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099 and founded the Crusader states in the Middle East, they soon encountered a power that seemed to them as foreign as it was dangerous: the assassins. For the Christian knights, these men from the mountains of Syria and Persia were mysterious figures who fought with daggers instead of swords and made the fear of their opponents the strongest weapon. However, the relationship between Crusaders and assassins was not only one of enmity, but also of tactical alliances. The assassins in Syria, whose center was Masyaf Castle, stood between powerful neighbors, the Sunni Zengids, later Saladin, and the Crusaders in the Holy Land. In order to survive, they had to maneuver skillfully, sometimes with the Christians, sometimes with the Muslims.
So it came about that they temporarily entered into alliances with the Crusaders, although at other times they became their victims. A notorious case was the murder of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192, who had recently been elected King of Jerusalem. Two assassins attacked him on the street and killed him. To this day, it is unclear who gave the order. Some chroniclers claimed that it was Richard the Lionheart, the English king, because he feared Conrad as a rival. Others thought it was Saladin, who wanted to weaken the new king. Perhaps the assassins acted out of their own calculation. The assassination attempt shows how difficult it was to distinguish truth from rumor in the web of intrigues, alliances, and enmities. The famous attempt to kill Saladin himself was also related to the Crusaders. Assassins attacked him twice, once even directly in his camp. Both times he barely survived. Some sources suspect that these attacks could have been supported or even commissioned by Crusaders. Whether this is true remains uncertain, but it illustrates how flexible the assassins were in their alliances. The Crusaders themselves vacillated between fascination and fear. Some princes, such as the Templars, fought directly against the assassins. Others sought their proximity. There are reports that Crusader princes paid tributes to avoid falling victim to their daggers. At the same time, wild stories circulated in Europe of secret rituals, of hashish intoxication and paradise gardens, of a sect that supposedly blindly obeyed the orders of its master. These legends shaped the image of the assassins in the West more than reality. The relationship is perhaps most evident in a famous episode, the encounter between the Syrian assassin leader and the English king Richard the Lionheart. Some sources report that Richard sought the support of the assassins. Others claim that he made peace with them in order not to become a target of their Fedayin. Whether historically verified or not, the fact that such stories were told at all shows what a powerful impression the assassins left. For the Crusaders, the assassins were enemies and possible partners at the same time. They could be unpredictable adversaries who killed high-ranking leaders, or useful allies who helped weaken other powers in the Middle East. In any case, they were a factor that could not be ignored. Thus, the encounters between assassins and Crusaders exemplified what distinguished the Nizarites throughout the Middle Ages, a small but influential community that played a role far beyond its numerical strength through clever politics, flexible alliances, and targeted terror.
Chapter 10: Life in the Shadows, Society and Everyday World in Alamut. When you think of the assassins today, you often only think of daggers, assassinations, and secret societies. But behind the dreaded Fedayin was an entire society that lived in castles like Alamut or Masyaf. There was a daily life that was shaped as much by faith and organization as by the dangers of a hostile world. Alamut was not just a fortress, but the center of a small but efficient state. Within its walls lived not only fighters, but also their families, craftsmen, scholars, and priests. Life was strictly regulated, characterized by discipline and a deep religious consciousness. Hasan-i Sabbah, the founder of Alamut, lived an ascetic life and demanded the same of his followers. No alcohol, no luxury, no waste. Everything served the survival of the community and the preservation of the faith. Everyday life and work. The inhabitants of Alamut were largely self-sufficient. Farmers in the surrounding valleys supplied grain, fruit, and vegetables. Craftsmen made tools, weapons, and clothing. There were bakeries, workshops, and pantries. The fortress was designed in such a way that it could survive longer sieges. Water pipes and cisterns secured the supply, while warehouses and magazines could hold supplies for years. The men were trained in martial arts and religion. The women ran the household, took care of children, and helped in agriculture. From an early age, children grew up in an environment where obedience to the imam and loyalty to the community were considered the highest virtues. Education and scholarship. A special feature of society was its education. In Alamut, there was a famous library that supposedly contained thousands of works, religious writings, philosophical texts, but also scientific works from medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The assassins were not only warriors, but also scholars who collected and preserved knowledge. Many of her books were unfortunately lost with the destruction of Alamut by the Mongols, but reports from later chroniclers suggest that one of the intellectual centers of Persia was located here. Religion and rituals. Everyday life was permeated by religion.
The Nizarite Ismailis saw in the hidden imam the source of all knowledge and legitimacy. Hasan-i Sabbah was his representative, and his instructions were considered binding. Religious teachings, sermons, and rituals determined the daily routine. It was not only about piety, but also about loyalty. Faith was the bond that held the community together and gave it the strength to defy the overpowering enemies. Discipline and rigor. Hasan-i Sabbah was notorious for his severity. Legends tell that he even had his own sons executed to show that no one was above the law. Whether this is historically true or not, it illustrates the image that contemporaries had of Alamut, a place where iron discipline prevailed, where everyone knew that betrayal or rule-breaking would not be tolerated. Life in the shadows. But despite all the austerity, life in Alamut was not only asceticism. There were parties, weddings, children's laughter. In the castles of the assassins, people lived like in any community, only in the constant awareness of being surrounded by enemies. The people knew that powerful empires outside wanted their destruction. This feeling of threat made them supportive and vigilant. So Alamut was more than a fortress. It was a small world of its own, a state in the shadows where religion, discipline, and knowledge formed a unique society. This is where the myth of the assassins was born, but it was also where families, children, and scholars lived, who lived their everyday lives beyond daggers and assassinations.
Chapter 11. Myths and Legends of Hashish, Paradise Gardens, and Marco Polo. The assassins were not only a real political and religious movement, they became a legend during their lifetime. Their opponents told stories that mixed truth and fantasy, and travelers like Marco Polo spread images that still shape Western understanding today. Some of these myths sprang from pure propaganda, others perhaps from a kernel of truth, but all of them together made the assassins a symbol of the mysterious and sinister. The hashish myth. The most well-known is the claim that the assassins used hashish to send their followers into a frenzy. The Arabic word hashishashin became assassin in the West, and soon it was associated with the idea of hashish eaters who went to their deaths stunned and without a will. But the sources are uncertain. Enemies such as the Sunni chroniclers probably used the term pejoratively to discredit the Nizarites as drug addicts. Historically, there is hardly any evidence that hashish was used systematically. It is much more likely that the Fedayin's motivation was religious faith and strict upbringing, not intoxicants. The Paradise Gardens. Another myth tells of mysterious gardens in Alamut. According to the report, Hasan-i Sabbah drugged young men, took them to a magnificent garden with flowing streams, fragrant flowers, and beautiful girls, a staging of paradise. After waking up, he told them, "Only through obedience to me and death in battle will you see this paradise again." This story was especially popularized by Marco Polo in the 13th century. Whether it was ever reality is doubtful. It is probably an exaggeration that arose from rumors and propaganda, but it was so catchy that it survives in the collective memory to this day. Marco Polo's reports. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo visited Persia and later reported in detail about the assassins in his travels. His descriptions of paradise gardens, virgins, and blind obedience made an enormous impression in Europe. They shaped the image of the assassins for centuries, not as a political religious movement, but as a mysterious sect that made its disciples submissive with intoxication and illusions. It is unclear whether Marco Polo himself believed these stories or only reproduced what he was told. What is certain is that he thus immortalized the myth of the assassins in the West. The fear of the opponents. The myths also served a political purpose. By portraying the assassins as fanatical, drug-intoxicated murderers, one could demonize their actions and explain their successes. For many rulers, it was easier to justify the attacks with witchcraft or deception than to acknowledge the political reality, that a small, determined group could shake powerful empires. Effect to this day. This myth still lives on today. The word assassin means murderer in the West, and films, novels, or computer games tie in with the stories of secret gardens and mystical rituals.
The assassins are thus an example of how historical movements are exaggerated by legends, so much so that the myths are often better known than reality. Thus, not only the memory of assassinations and castles remain of the assassins, but also a web of stories that merge truth and fiction. They were real, but they also became an invention of fantasy, a reflection of the fears and longings of their contemporaries.
Chapter 12. Relations with the Islamic World, Between Tolerance and Hostility. The assassins did not exist in a vacuum. They were embedded in an Islamic world marked by power struggles, religious tensions, and shifting alliances. Their story is therefore not only that of a secret society, but also that of a small but influential actor who had to assert himself among the great forces of his time. At the heart of these tensions was the antagonism between Sunnis and Shiites. The assassins, as Nizarites, a current of the Shiite Ismailis, were dangerous apostates for the Sunni rulers. The Seljuks, in particular, who acted as defenders of the Sunni Caliphate, saw them as a threat. Again and again, they tried to take their castles and extinguish the movement. But the Fedayins' assassinations made any attack risky, and the Seljuks often had to watch their own leaders fall victim to the dagger. But not all relationships were all hostile. Again and again, there were phases of coexistence and tolerance. Local rulers, who were themselves involved in power struggles, used the assassins as allies or accepted their existence as long as they did not dare to revolt openly. In some regions, assassins lived peacefully alongside Sunni neighbors. Trade was conducted, alliances were formed. The boundaries between enemy and friend were often fluid, depending on the political situation. The relationship with other Shiite groups is particularly interesting. The assassins saw themselves as the true guardians of the Imamate idea, and as a result, conflicts arose within the Shiite spectrum. The followers of other imams did not recognize the authority of the Nizarites, which increased tensions and hostilities. In the Islamic world, the assassins were often isolated, fought by the Sunnis, eyed with suspicion by many Shiites. Despite this isolation, the assassins managed to maintain their position for centuries. Their secret lay in their flexibility. Where direct confrontation was impossible, they relied on diplomacy. Where negotiations did not help, the daggers of the Fedayins spoke. They knew how to keep their opponents under control not only through violence, but also through the threat of violence. Often, a sign, a dagger in the door of an enemy ruler, was enough to persuade him to give in. At the same time, the assassins contributed to the fact that the Islamic world could never completely destroy them. They did not have the power to conquer great empires, but they were strong enough to be a constant danger. You couldn't ignore them, and that's exactly where their strength lay. The relationship with the Islamic world therefore constantly fluctuated between hostility, tolerance, and cautious cooperation. The assassins were outsiders and heretics in the eyes of many, but they were also skilled survivors who always found ways to secure their existence. In this field of tension, they developed their very own identity, an identity that moved between isolation and influence, between rejection and secret respect. This shows that the history of the assassins was not only a fight against external enemies, but also a constant struggle for recognition and survival in a world that was mostly hostile to them. Her ability to survive in this environment explains why her movement lasted so long, and why she is still fascinated today.
Chapter 13. The Assassins and the Mongols. The End of Alamut. For more than a century and a half, the assassins had outwitted their enemies, repelled attacks, and survived through cunning, diplomacy, and targeted assassinations. But in the 13th century, a new power arose against which even they could do nothing: the Mongols. The Mongols were different from all previous opponents. While the Seljuks, Crusaders, and even Saladin could often be involved in diplomatic games, the Mongols knew no compromises. They roamed Asia with a merciless war machine, destroying entire cities and leaving scorched earth behind them. Under Genghis Khan and later his successors, they created an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. When the Mongols invaded Persia, the assassins inevitably stood in the way.
Their castles, including Alamut, were strategic points that the Mongols could not tolerate. Initially, the Nizarites tried to act diplomatically. They offered submission, sent envoys, and hoped to appease the Mongols by tribute. But the Mongols were not impressed. For them, it was unimaginable to tolerate a community that put rulers in fear through its assassinations. The role of Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who was given the task of subjugating the Muslim world, was particularly decisive. Hulagu began to systematically besiege the castles of the assassins. Their defensive force, which had previously stopped even powerful armies, was powerless against the siege techniques of the Mongols. With catapults, siege towers, and sheer superiority, the Mongols advanced. In 1256, Alamut fell. The once impregnable fortress, symbol of the power and myth of the assassins, has been destroyed. Chroniclers report that the library with its countless writings was burned, an irretrievable loss for the knowledge of the time. Whether all the books were really destroyed is disputed, but what is certain is that the splendor of Alamut was extinguished. The Mongols showed no mercy. Many inhabitants of the fortresses were massacred, the castles razed. The old man of the mountain, the then leader Rukh ad-Din Kershaw, surrendered in the hope of saving his people, but the Mongols did not let him live either. The assassins lost their heart, their castles, their library, their center. With the fall of Alamut, the power of the Persian assassins was broken. Their system, which for so long was based on deterrence and the invincibility of their fortresses, could not withstand the brutal force of the Mongols. Nevertheless, this was not the absolute end. Some groups survived in Syria, where their castles held out for a while before the Mamluks gained the upper hand there as well. The fall of Alamut marked the end of an era. The assassins had built up a unique form of power over generations, but against a violence like that of the Mongols, no cunning, no strategy, and no dagger was effective. But their myth survived the downfall, and perhaps grew precisely because their real power was so suddenly extinguished.
Chapter 14. The Legacy in Persia and Syria. Survival in the Underground. With the destruction of Alamut in 1256, the Mongols had destroyed the heart of the assassins. But no matter how thoroughly they proceeded, they could not completely extinguish the movement. The Nizarites, as they called themselves, survived, in scattered communities, in smaller castles, underground. The myth was tarnished, but not gone. In Persia, the defeat was particularly difficult. The castles in the Alborz Mountains, which were once considered impregnable, lay in ruins. Many leaders were dead or executed, and the community lost its central organization. Nevertheless, smaller groups persisted in remote regions. They lived in seclusion, adapted to the new rulers, and survived through adaptation and secrecy. In Syria, the situation was somewhat different. There, the assassins had controlled several castles since the 12th century, including the famous Masyaf fortress. Here, they ruled relatively independently, in the field of tension between Crusaders, Zengids, and later the Ayyubids under Saladin. Even after the destruction of Alamut, the Syrian assassins remained in place for the time being. They were too small to be a great power, but too dangerous to be ignored. But pressure also grew in Syria. After all, it was the Mamluks, the new masters of Egypt and Syria, who subdued the assassins. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, a brilliant strategist, realized that he could not control them through fear of assassination, but only through direct rule. Step by step, he brought their castles under his control until the assassins lost their independence there as well. Nevertheless, the Nizarites did not disappear. They found ways to preserve their identity. Without large castles, without spectacular assassinations, they continued to live as small communities in Persia, Syria, and later also in India. Their religious heritage remained alive. The idea of the imam as a spiritual leader, the emphasis on knowledge and spirituality, the solidarity of the community. Precisely because they no longer appeared as dangerous assassins, they were able to survive during this time. They adapted to political realities, paid tributes, stayed away from major conflicts, and focused on their own religious practice. While their name became synonymous with murder in the West, the actual Nizarites slowly evolved into a more peaceful, quieter community.
In a way, this was the beginning of the transition from the feared assassins to the modern Ismailis, who are now united under the title of the Aga Khan. Survival in the underground was the key. No longer open confrontation, but adaptation, patience, and the preservation of inner faith. Thus, the 13th and 14th centuries show that the history of the assassins did not end with Alamut. They lost their castles, their daggers, and their terror, but they survived. Their legacy changed, but it remained. And it was precisely this survival in the shadows that made it possible for the movement to survive not only as a myth, but also as a real community to the present day.
Chapter 15. The Image of the Assassins in the Middle Ages, Fascination and Terror in Europe. While the assassins existed as a real political force in the Middle East, in Europe they took on the form of a bogeyman. News of mysterious murderers who eliminated kings and military leaders with daggers spread quickly, and where facts were lacking, legends emerged. Thus, in medieval Europe, the image of the assassins became a mixture of fear, fascination, and fantasy. The first direct contacts were established through the Crusades. European knights, pilgrims, and clergy met the assassins in Syria, where they held castles such as Masyaf. Some crusaders reported alliances, others assassinations against Christian leaders. The murder of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192 in particular shook Europe. Contemporaries wondered whether Richard the Lionheart himself had a hand in it, a rumor that made the reputation of the assassins even more mysterious. But what was a concrete experience in the Middle East became a legend in Europe. Chroniclers such as William of Tyre described the assassins as a sinister sect that blindly obeyed their old man of the mountain. Soon it was said that this mysterious ruler could use intoxicants and illusions to persuade his men to sacrifice their lives without hesitation. This solidified the idea of the hashish eater, an explanation that seemed more understandable to Europeans than the idea of religious conviction and strict discipline. Marco Polo in particular contributed to the popularization of this image in the 13th century. In his travelogues, he described the alleged paradise gardens of Alamut, where Hasan-i Sabbah put his disciples in a state of intoxication and led them to believe heavenly joys. In this way, Marco Polo wrote, he bound them to himself and sent them out into the world for assassinations. Whether Polo believed this story or just passed it on remains unclear, but it shaped Western understanding for centuries. In Europe, the assassins were soon no longer associated with the complex reality of Nizaritism, but with an image of demonic assassins. Their name became proverbial. The word assassin entered many European languages and developed the meaning murderer, detached from the actual historical group. At the same time, the myth exerted a certain fascination. Knights, accustomed to the strict rules of honor and open combat, saw in the assassins a dark reflection. Men who fought in the shadows without regard for their own lives, where cunning and dagger were mightier than sword and army. This fascination lasted into modern times, when poets, painters, and historians continued to embellish the stories. In this way, a picture emerged in medieval Europe that only partially corresponded to reality. The assassins were in fact a religious political minority fighting for survival. But in Europe, they became a mystical secret society, half feared, half admired. This image has survived for centuries and is still alive today, perhaps stronger than historical reality. Chapter 16. The Assassins in Modern Times, From Memory to Legend. After the destruction of Alamut by the Mongols and the subjugation of Syrian castles by the Mamluks, the assassins gradually disappeared from the headlines of medieval chroniclers. But as their real power faded, a new chapter began. The legend of the assassins took shape in the world's imagination and grew far beyond historical reality. In the Islamic world, the Nizarites continued to live, but mostly secluded, as small communities in Persia, Syria, and later also in India. They gave up the spectacular attacks and concentrated on their religious identity. For many Muslim rulers, they were no longer the dangerous heretics, but rather a fringe group that was tolerated as long as they remained loyal. But the memory of their former power, of daggers that threatened even sultans, remained alive and was passed on from generation to generation. In Europe, the legend developed in a very special direction.
Travelers like Marco Polo had laid the foundation stone, and now scholars, chroniclers, and poets took up the stories. In the Renaissance, the assassins began to be portrayed not only as gruesome murderers, but also as fascinating secret society members. Their alleged rituals, the secret gardens, and the mystical education of the Fedayin were embellished and romanticized. Especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, when interest in Oriental studies grew, European researchers rediscovered the sources. Attempts were made to scientifically process the history of the assassins, but often romantic fantasy and colonial curiosity were mixed. Books, novels, and reports shaped the image of a secret, dangerous sect that could secretly steer the fate of the world. This image fit well into a time when secret societies such as the Freemasons, Illuminati, or Templars fired the imagination. The assassins were placed in this rank as the forerunners of a tradition in which secrets, rituals, and conspiracies determined the fate of peoples. Thus, in modern times, they changed from a real religious movement to a symbol. They no longer stood for the concrete politics of the Middle East, but for the universal, the power of the invisible, the danger of secrecy, the fascination with the forbidden. They also found their place in literature. European authors took up the stories, sometimes as warning examples, sometimes as material for adventures. In novels and plays, the assassins appeared as masters of deception, as men who could change the world with a dagger. Meanwhile, the real Nizarites continued to change. They became part of the modern Ismaili community, which was organized under spiritual leaders, the later Aga Khans. The distance between myth and reality became larger and larger. Thus, the modern era shows two things. On the one hand, the survival of a community that preserved its roots, and on the other hand, the immortality of a myth that unfolded its very own dynamics in Europe and finally worldwide. The assassins were real, but in memory, they became more than that, a legend that endured for centuries and lives on to this day.
Chapter 17. The Nizarites Today, From the Assassins to the Aga Khan. When people talk about the assassins today, many people think of daggers, assassinations, and dark secret societies. But the descendants of this community still exist, and they have developed into a modern, peaceful religious community known as the Nizarite Ismailis. Their story shows how a movement that once stood for terror and terror changed, adopted, and survived over centuries. After the fall of Alamut in the 13th century, the Nizarites did not disappear. They continued to live in scattered communities, especially in Persia, Syria, and later also in India. There, they developed a religious identity that was strongly oriented towards the belief in the living imam, a direct descendant of Ali and Fatima who led the community as a spiritual leader. This imam was the link between God and believers, a teacher and role model. Over the centuries, the Nizarites increasingly withdrew from big politics. Instead of assassinations and power struggles, religion, education, and survival as a minority were now in the foreground. In India, a significant community was formed, often referred to as Khoja Ismailis, who were in close contact with the imam. In the 19th century, the development took a new turn. The then imam Hasan-i Shah received the title Aga Khan from the Shah of Persia. From this point on, the spiritual leaders of the Nizarites became known throughout the world as the Aga Khans. They led their community not only religiously, but also socially and politically. The Aga Khans shaped the transition of the Nizarites into the modern age. They promoted education, healthcare, and social development. Schools, hospitals, and foundations sprang up, improving the lives of the community and many others. Especially in the 20th century, they played an important role in international politics and interreligious dialogue. Today, Nizarites live all over the world, from East Africa to South and Central Asia to Europe and North America. Its spiritual leader, the current Aga Khan IV, Karim al-Husseini, is a respected personality who is committed to development aid, cultural promotion, and understanding between religions. Under his leadership, the Nizarites have built up a worldwide network of institutions that have an impact far beyond their own community. Thus, the history of the Nizarites is a history of transformation. Feared assassins became scholars, secret societies became an open community, fighters in the shadows became a modern, internationally networked religious group. But despite this profound transformation, the legacy of the past lives on.
The Nizarites know about their history, even if they prefer to see the bloody part as a chapter of necessity in a hostile world. For the world, however, the name assassin remains inseparable from them, as a myth that has long since taken on a life of its own. The fate of the Nizarites shows that even the darkest movements can change. What once spread terror can now become a source of knowledge, social commitment, and peace.
Chapter 18. Reverberation, the myth of the invisible blade. With the fall of Alamut and the subjugation by the Mongols, the power of the assassins seemed to be broken. But as their castles crumbled and their organization survived in hiding, another, perhaps even more powerful force began to work: myth. The stories of the Fedayin, who blindly obeyed their master and went to their deaths without fear, spread far beyond the Middle East. To their Muslim opponents, they were heretics and dangerous rebels. For the Crusaders, they were both enemies and fascinating allies. And for Europe, they became a projection screen for fear and curiosity, a secret brotherhood that could bring down rulers and kings from the shadows. The legends of hashish, gardens of paradise, and Marco Polo mixed with the real attacks and created an image that still resonates today. As early as the Middle Ages, the word assassin became synonymous with murderer in European languages. The actual religious and social complexity of the Nizarites was lost in the process. What remained was the idea of silent blades, invisible fighters, and secret rituals. But it was precisely this distortion that made the myth immortal. In modern times, the assassins found their way into novels, plays, and later into films, comics, and video games. Especially in modern pop culture, such as in the successful Assassin's Creed series, they became heroes and anti-heroes, whose daggers in the shadows influence an entire world history. The myth of the invisible blade lives on because it addresses universal themes: the power of the few against the many, the courage or fanaticism of the individual willing to sacrifice everything, and the fascination with the secret that works in secret. At the same time, the real story of the assassins reminds us that there was a real community behind this myth. Men, women, and children who lived in castles like Alamut cultivated a strict religion and asserted their place in the midst of hostile great powers. Their assassinations were not random murders, but part of a survival strategy born of weakness and threat. Today, their descendants exist as a peaceful community of the Nizarites under the leadership of the Aga Khan. They have long since laid down the dagger, but the memory of their past remains part of their identity and part of world history. Thus, the story of the assassins ends with a double legacy: the real one, which lives on in a lively community, and the mythical one, which continues to have an effect today in narratives, art, and fantasy. Between truth and legend, between horror and fascination, her name remains immortal, a symbol of the invisible blade that made history in the shadows.